That's right, yeah. I know you like it
Yeah, I know.
So it just takes a couple of
Right, it is being recorded, yeah. Okay.
all questions go to the end.
Yeah,
My name is Glenn Reid. I'm the Minister and Sports Manager and Facility Leader here at the Law Society, and I'm chairing this afternoon session. So just to explain to you briefly, we have three presentations, two presentations and a participative workshop. So all have your laptops or your iPads ready for the third session. I have been warned to be very strict on time. So it's 20 minutes and I'm the hatchet. So I will, don't take me being rude, I will be calling 5 minutes and 2 minutes from the speaker so that they know to keep the time. We will keep some time at the end for questions. So there will be 10 or 15 minutes at the very end of all three presentations for the questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My name is Louise. I'm from. I'm doing a PhD in Glasgow Caledonian University. Just to outline just my title there. When I talk about we, I'm talking about us generally as the EdTech community, people who are using education technology for lecturing in higher education, and those people who are supporting it. So I'll flesh out what I mean by scholarly, but it is just generally the application of scholarship in the area of using technology for teaching. So my title, as it stands, is "What Role Does Theory Play in University Teaching with Digital Technologies?" Now I'm just going to take a slice of that for today's presentation and talk about that. But my aim was to explore the attitudes and experiences of lecturers who are using technology in their teaching and higher education, with a view to looking at what theory might lie behind that practice. So my design was a qualitative project. I did semi-structured interviews, 25 of them, with lecturers. And I also did a short questionnaire beforehand, which has actually proved to be quite fruitful, and I'll be showing you some of the data from that as well. But that was really just a pre-interview questionnaire, just to get a grounding in terms of what sort of level people were at, what experience they had, what kind of qualifications they had, and so on. I did it in 2 universities, one in Scotland, one in Ireland, mainly because I could come home and visit my family, but not necessarily for means of comparison, but just to kind of get a richness and a broadness of data there, and across 7 disciplines, so 2 to 3 lecturers from each discipline in different universities. I used my theoretical framework is Rhizome theory, which I'm not going to talk about today. You might be grateful to hear, but I'm welcome to have discussions with any about that afterwards. So, diving straight into some of the data that I've got. This just orientates you in terms of this diagram. I'm only going to show you one of these. The right-hand side is all my participants, all my interviews, all 25 of the lecturers. And the left-hand side is just some of the kind of markers about scholarship. So we're looking at things like, has somebody published, the very top one there, published in education? So have they published on their teaching practice, not publishing on their discipline? Obviously teaching qualifications, their engagement with academic development, peer-reviewed teaching, whether they've had peers in the classroom, or whether they've done things like engaged with educational research as a reader, and have they shared practice. So the way of reading this is by looking at the kind of size of that ribbon, and that indicates a greater number. So you can see, for example, down here, one person, Steve in the bottom, has only shared practice. He hasn't done any of this other kind of scholarship activity, whereas someone at the top, Ashling and Emma, these are all pseudonyms, obviously, bear no resemblance to anyone there. These people are much more heavily engaged in different things there. So you can see stuff like shared practice is quite prevalent. Reading educational research. Everyone said they read educational research. I'll come back to that point. And then not many people peer-reviewed academic development. About half of people engage regularly with academic development, meaning professional development work, so non-accredited workshops, seminars, things like that. Again, about half had a teaching qualification, and then even fewer than that had published on educational research. So that just gives you a broad overview of the kind of scholarly, educationally scholarly activity that the lecturers partook in. So the first thing I have to say about this is that it's not, these aren't, quantitative quadrants. This is just a way I've sliced the data to be able to kind of analyse how these things break down in terms of scholarship and what people were doing. So this is a way of looking at the data and say, what were they using technology for? So looking at those boxes, this top one up here, the core teaching, this is when people were using their technology to replace something that would have happened face-to-face. So something like a lecture. They were doing something online instead of that lecture. On the far right-hand side there, the core student activities, when students were doing something using digital technology. So this is when the students were active, they were engaged in using technology for something, usually an assessed piece of work or a number of assessed pieces of work. Down the bottom right-hand side, the broadcasters used alternative routes. So this is the thinking behind that is somebody who might have been to a lecture, they might have missed it, give them another way of getting that information across, using an alternative route, using technology as an alternative route to the same learning. And then the dabblers were adding on stuff, just kind of little sort of extra bits and pieces. The other thing I want to say about this is that these behaviours, people displayed multiple behaviours. So it wasn't that one people you could box them in one or only. Most people were in 1, 2, or 3 of these particular behaviours. So adding on to that, the reasons people gave for doing these different things, pragmatists, and the reason why I call them pragmatists is because they were doing it for very pragmatic reasons. They wanted the students to have that flexibility of being able to get to view or engage with materials, lectures, whatever it was, wherever they were. So it was a flexibility for the students. Distance learning, that's where distance learning kind of fit in. For the pedagogues, it was all about engagement, so getting the students active. The reason why I call them pedagogues is that sometimes there was a quite obvious sort of pedagogical reason behind what they were doing there, is to get the students active, involved, and engaged, and often using that as a way for assessment. Broadcasters, I don't mean that in a pejorative term, it's just something that kind of, they were kind of broadcasting on multiple channels, I suppose, so that they were bringing content to students, and their reasons mostly were levelling, so bringing students up to a same level, so maybe using additional things for if you've got your widening participation agenda, things like that. People were bringing students up to a same level and then moving them on together as a group. And then finally, it was about enhancement with the dabblers, the people who were dipping their toe in the water of technology. They were just enhancing stuff, adding things on in that way. So the kind of things, those boxes there shows the kind of things that they were doing. So obviously online lectures, things like video lectures, pre-recorded or live online lectures, a lot of content. Content was prevalent here. Pedagogues were using 2 types of tools really. One was the more self-completion activities, so things like MCQs with automatic feedback. So you set them up and off they run. The other side was the more kind of content creation end of things. So students were creating content, using wikis, blogs, discussions, adding comments to other people's blogs. That much more interactive, much more content creating on behalf of the student. And also things like virtual worlds fell into that category as well. For the broadcasters, a lot of that was about lecture capture. So they'd give a live lecture, captures, and then for students who weren't there, who couldn't be there, for whatever reason, they'd provide it online afterwards. Similar for things like digital content, people had websites and things like that, where they just added content that they thought might get their students to a certain level. Screencasting was something that seemed to be on the up in terms of doing very short little videos, explanatory videos, and these were across all of the disciplines, and using things like Explain Everything, that app, for example. And finally, things like classroom clickers and using, say, a video of YouTube in the lecture, things like that would be the kind of thing that the dabblers were doing. So looking at behind what's going on there and what they said they were doing and what the theory they said was behind it, the pragmatists were all about independent learning. Now, when I kind of drilled down a little bit and thought about what are they saying when they're actually using the term independent learning, they were talking about students learning independently of them up to a point. So they were still going through very structured materials, but it wasn't true independent learning in sort of the literature sense of independent learning where the student is an adult and they're directing themselves towards their own content. Very tightly structured activities or content up here. The pedagogues, well, they kind of hit an awful lot of the kind of more kind of I suppose the kind of Web 2 type of active learning things that we talk about, active learning, experiential learning, all the buzzwords are in there, social learning, collaboration, getting students to work together in groups. All of that was in that, either explicitly or implicitly there within the data. Broadcasters, interestingly, talked an awful lot about learning styles and about how different students bring different learning styles to the equation. I'll come back to that in a minute. And dabblers would talk a lot about bigger picture learning. So they were adding these enhancements on and as a way of getting the students to think about joining the dots between some of the things, but it wasn't a core part of the assessment or a module, but it was about joining some dots together. I find that quite interesting because actually in contrast to these people up here, they had quite well-defined learning outcomes that they were trying to hit. Or pedagogues often talked about skills and getting them practicing skills online, whereas the dabblers were actually a little bit more, I don't know how to say it, a little bit more kind of bigger in what they were thinking about. And the other thing I wanted to just draw to attention in terms of these four types of behaviours, these people were very low in their engagement with professional development, academic development, strikingly so. And I think what I can interpret from that is that they were getting a lot of this stuff, well, they were just doing it just in time. They were just getting it out the door. They have a module to run, it's got to be online next year, they're just getting it out the door. So there wasn't time for this, they might have done a little bit of last minute training, but they weren't doing an awful lot of, ongoing training. And then it was there, it was in stone, and then it just happened. The pedagogues, very high in terms of their professional development, continually going back to stuff regularly, updating their skills and their skill set. Equally, kind of very low academic development interest here. Very high reading of the literature on education in this group, though. And again, I think that may be driven a bit by discipline, and the discipline, how people are kind of engaging with the education research through their own discipline. So it's not coming from the institution in these people. Yeah, and these people didn't engage with educational research much at all. That's the other thing. So I'll just give you a few little samples of some of the data just to prove that I did actually speak to people. So I felt there was a lot of theories that were there. There were theorized practices and there were untheorized practices. Alice and Lynn, two different subject areas, did very similar things. They were using wikis with their students to create content. So there was a sort of real-world simulation and entrepreneurship where they had an entrepreneur from Canada who was coming in and they were discussing a kind of a scenario with a real company, and her students were working through that. And Alice hit all the buzzwords in terms of active learning, all the experiential learning. It was all about real world, it was all about process-based learning and all the things that she had her learning outcomes very well worked out. Lynn, on the other hand, who's a very experienced social sciences and criminology lecturer, she was doing an intellectual collaboration across a number of other universities where the students worked together on a scenario, often in a more sort of CSI type of thing, where they'd each role play a particular role within the crime situation. So that she'd be looking at their writing skills, their academic skills, their communication skills, but she very clearly identified they've got traditional learning, so that was the lecturers face-to-face, they learn what they learn themselves and what they teach each other on the wiki. So she knew what was going on. So, but it was a different way of sort of framing it. And whereas Alice had a kind of the words there to describe what was going on, Lynn sort of had some more intuitive knowledge of what was happening and this experience of what was happening. Interestingly, Lynn had the teaching qualification and Alice did not. I don't know why that is, but I think this is because that discipline, entrepreneurship in particular, had the terminology sort of built into it. It was a newish discipline, and the terminology for their teaching was highermost in their minds. Moving on, maybe. So, about some of the cultural truisms and folk pedagogies that I was coming across. Now, there is this narrative about digital natives, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and I'm not going to rehash the arguments for and against it, but suffice to say that I can see that there's a sort of continuum here, but there's also something being reinforced for lecturers in the classroom about things like the student have this affinity with technology. We have to use the modes that they're comfortable with to try and transfer that knowledge. Now, I'm just interested as well in the terms that you use, transfer that knowledge, of what that means in terms of what knowledge is for her and how students build that knowledge or not, or whether it's transferred to them. Anyway, I won't go there yet. That's their language, and babies have iPads these days. So there was these kind of ideas about digital natives coming through, and all of these responses were an answer to the question, why do you use technology? So they weren't saying because it's helping learning, they were saying because that's where the kids are at, you know? So I think there's sort of some things there we have to unpick a little bit in terms of what people are thinking. And it, again, to tap into Audrey Waters' keynote this morning, sometimes we prefer the fiction to the facts, you know? And that is a little bit of an easy way out to think about why we were using technology, right? So, the other one was learning styles. Again, I don't really want to get into this debate too much, but it is something that there has been a debate about in terms of what learning styles are, whether they actually have been empirically proved to exist, and whether it is something that we can talk about as something that is being actual and real and something that exists. Again, it's something that lecturers are intuitively latching onto. There's traction there in terms of, well, there are students who have different aptitudes. Does that mean they equal learning styles? I'm not so sure. But again, these are all answers people gave using that's the way they learn. It would be the different learning styles. Now, there's something of truth in this. But it's just, again, as that as being something that's being put forward as a theoretical reason as to why they're using technology, I think we have to be a little bit critical of it. So, my findings, in brief, are there seem to be invisible pedagogies there. There are people who are doing things, and they're and you can see there's a pedagogical underpinning towards it, but they're not articulating it. Now, I can't say what the reasons are behind that. It may be just it's lost in the mists of time why they started doing it that way. It may be so embedded in the discipline that it's not discussed very much. But it's definitely underspoken about, and I suppose and there are things going on that are possibly untheorized practices. Similarly, there are unpracticed theories. I have a huge amount of data of people talking about what should be done, not what they actually do, but what they think is the right thing to do in technology. And an even greater chunk of my data is about people saying, well, what other people are doing, but without, talking about what that is exactly, who those people are, and what's so wrong about it. But there's an awful lot of this discourse about this right and wrongness, and actually, it's not that simple. There is explicit evidence-based theory coming from some disciplines, but it's coming from within the discipline a lot of the time. When people are using the terminology, it seems to be coming from the discipline itself. And academic development, professional development is bring great ideas to people, And teaching qualifications seem to be providing, in my data anyway, they seem to be providing the theoretical understanding behind things. But lecturers seem to have a problem bringing the two together. It's like, yes, I can do this with Wiki, and there's this weird thing going on about social constructivism, but I can't quite put them together somehow for that person's discipline and for their teaching. The truisms, the folk pedagogies, the bowl of happiness that Audrey Water spoke about this morning, these things are being seen as theory and are being presented as theory, and I think we just have to challenge ourselves a little bit more on that. I suspect a lot of the practices that I was talking to people about were retrospectively theorized and saying, well, this is why I was doing it. Actually, a lot of technology you just go and try, and there's nothing wrong with that. You just, you throw it at the wall and see if it sticks. And there's a retrospective theory. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just, I think that might be what was happening sometimes. And lecturers engage with the literature, but don't apply it. Again, there's these kind of gaps. It's kind of hard to see, well, I read this, but it doesn't quite apply to me. It's something slightly different. So my recommendations, as I think I've hinted already, is to help the lecturers link the literature and these idealized use of technology and their teaching practice. So bring all these things together. And we as a community need to engage critically with the education theory and the education technology theory. It has to be an ongoing discussion. Sometimes I think because we're still getting people on board, we end up using sort of shortcuts. And I think we need to maybe push ourselves a little bit more. And question the orthodoxies that are there and the idealized technology. It's all very well to be saying things about technology, but also these ideas of idealized students. Like well, if the student's right, then this technology will work. But if the student isn't right, anyway. And value bought sense rather than taught sense, because I think a lot of lecturers have an understanding of what they're doing intuitively from experience. And sometimes when you just go and try it yourself, rather than going and reading it in the literature, there is something pedagogically sound in terms of what they're doing, and incorporating that more into and using that, turning that into scholarship, I suppose, is what I'm saying. And recognise contextual differences. Disciplines are different, and individuals are different. So I suppose the questions that I have, I'd like some answers for, are things like where do these invisible pedagogies come from? And is it a problem that they're invisible? Does everybody have to theorize what they're doing on some esoteric level? And does teaching need to be scholarly? And what's the balance there? Where do we stop, I suppose, or where do we start in terms of what we need lecturers to do and how they speak about the lecturing? And I suppose what this ends up is the idea of the professionalization of teaching, and where do we go with that? And I've worked across two countries on this, but I know that Scotland and Ireland are in two different places on that at the moment. But I'd welcome any of your comments about that afterwards. And that's my rhizome, which I'm not going to talk about, but a good picture there. It's a weed. Thank you very much.